Welcome back to my channel, Act on Mental Health. My name is Sean Hardy, and I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in Indiana. Now, on this channel, we discuss acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, as well as the science behind it, RFT, or relational frame theory. As I create content, I want to make things that I'm most passionate about, most knowledgeable about, the things that I know will help improve lives. So over the next few weeks, I'm going to try to experiment a little bit and put things out there that I think will help you. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear something specific about ACT or RFT. ACT is an experiential form of therapy that helps clients come to know by way of their experience. It's similar to CBT, but instead of challenging thoughts, ACT chooses acceptance of our inner experiences and teaches psychological flexibility. One of the exciting things about ACT is its utility and pragmatic approach. If something doesn't click, don't use it. If it works, do more of it. ACT uses a variety of metaphors to teach the 6 core processes. And conceptually, clients come to understand how their inner experiences function and why they do what they do. ACT then uses exercises like the one I'm about to show you to extend a person's conceptual knowledge of their condition and broaden it by application in the therapy room. In a way, the therapist helps the client to experientially understand ACT concepts through guided practices. Now, if you've watched some of my earlier videos, you've already seen a few of the mindfulness exercises, as well as a few of the common metaphors. While mindfulness is important to distancing yourself from inner content like thoughts, memories, emotions, and sensations, ACT has exercises that create something RFT calls transformation of stimulus function. This simply means that a person learns a new frame or meaning to an existing network of other meanings, and that changes the network and how that person relates to this frame in the future. I'll come back to this a little later in the video, but for now, these exercises jumpstart a client's learning that can affect how they interact with their inner content in the future. Now, I've broken down this video into 3 sections. First, I'm going to demonstrate this exercise as if I would do it in a therapy session. Second, I'm going to teach you what's happening from the client's perspective by giving you 3 real-life examples from clients that I've had. And third, I'm going to teach you what's happening in this exercise from the therapist's perspective. My goal is to teach you something about ACT that's useful for your everyday life and something that you can use whether you're in therapy or using it for self-therapy or you're using it to conduct therapy. The resource with the script will be available in the description below. If you're willing to do so, I'd like to try out another strategy with you here today. Now, we've been talking about depression, and conceptually, you understand what depression's doing to you. It's kind of like that tug of war metaphor that I talked about, where it kind of pulls you in. The more energy you give, the more you find yourself invested in winning this war. Well, this strategy is going to kind of build on it, but it's going to do it a little differently. So I'm going to ask you where you're seated there to go ahead and close your eyes, if you would, and I want you to begin to imagine yourself here in this room. I want you to center yourself. So where you're at, where you're seated, I want you to kind of feel the contact that your body's making with the chair. And I want you to imagine this depression as an object. It can be any object that you prefer, but I want you to give it its own shape, its own color. I want you to really think of an object that accurately describes your feeling and your thoughts of depression. Do you have that? Good. So I want you to go ahead and try to put that object about 4 or 5 feet in front of you, just right here in the middle of the floor between you and I. If this feeling of depression had a size, how big would it be? And if it had a color, what color would it be? And if it had a speed, how fast would it go? If this feeling of depression had a shape, what would it be? If it had a weight, how much would it weigh? Imagine being able to reach out and touch it. What temperature is it when you touch it? What type of texture does it have? We're going to stop here with the object here in the middle of the room. And with a client, what I would do is I would have other relevant emotions, thoughts, memories, sensations that they've had, and I would ask them to do an object for those. And so we'd probably have 3, 4, 5 objects here in the middle of the room. And so after we've gotten a fairly large sample, we would go back to the first and focus and see if it's changed. Sometimes there might be, the object might have kind of gotten bigger or smaller or changed in some way. So we're going to note any changes that the physical object has had. If it hasn't changed, we'll note that as well. And we're just going to notice any reaction that they're having to seeing their object in the middle of the room and how that feels, like not having it in their head, but having it out here in view that the therapist can see and they can see. Something else I might do is I might have them move it side to side, or I might have them attempt to pick it up and just kind of hold it. But I'll have them do something to try to interact with those objects. And then once we've done that, I'm going to have them put it back inside. And then I'm going to kind of debrief a little bit, and I'll ask them, if the depression has diminished. And a lot of times their reactions will be quite different than where we started earlier in the session. And so I'll note all those reactions and then begin to kind of interact with that object and actually refer to that object throughout the rest of the session. And this will be new content for us to discuss and also be able to help them to transform how that object and that emotion or thought functions for them. In this next section, I want to talk about what's happening in this exercise from the client's perspective. And I want to give you 3 real-life examples from clients that I've had. The first 2 are from one client that I had, and we'll give him a fictitious name, Gabriel. And Gabriel was a 29-year-old male, single, and it's just life wasn't working. He had several diagnoses: general anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, major depressive disorder, and ADHD. So he had been riddled with several dysfunctional disorders and just trying to get his life to work. And so we talked a lot about depression. We talked a lot about anxiety. And so he had some different objects that I thought were really unique and something that led to some breakthroughs for that client in understanding his own condition and then to begin to make some changes that were positive to improve his life. The first example was of anxiety. And when I asked him to put it or to give it an object, he chose a Rubik's Cube. And as we were talking, he was talking about this Rubik's Cube and, the size, the shape. And what he did, which was unusual, was he had like hundreds of Rubik's Cubes, and he compared it to anxiety because he couldn't seem to finish anything. Like he'd start one thing and then get up to the next thing. And his whole life was like these incomplete Rubik's Cubes. I just thought that was a really great image for us to begin to discuss. Because what we found through that was that there were some solutions there that he didn't know how to get. And with learning Rubik's Cube, there are certain formulas you have to do to make the sides all the same colors. And it's really complex and hard when you first try to do it. But then once you learn how the formulas work, it becomes very easy and second nature. And so it gave him some hope for the anxieties that there would be some solutions there. But it was a great visual for this person who had all these incomplete tasks all around and knowing there's a solution, but not knowing how to complete it. The second object that he gave that I thought was really, really great was referring to depression as a cardboard box. And so he gave it the dimensions of a cardboard box that somebody who works for FedEx would carry. And when I asked him how much it weighed, I was thinking it's going to be really heavy, but he said it's light, but it's just something that I have to hold. It's something it takes up space. I just know it's there, and it's hard to do anything because this depression is right there. And through discussing this with him and interacting with this, he actually brought up this solution that he could take this cardboard box of depression and he could take it with him he could put it in his car and as he's driving to the place that he needs to go with his depression. I just thought that was great use of this exercise. The third example that I'll give is from a client that I met with for about a year, or maybe a little over a year, and we'll give her a fictitious name, Sharon. Sharon was unique in that she had a very difficult uh, difficult life, chronic pain. She had diagnoses of PTSD from severe sexual trauma as a child. She had complicated grief from her husband that she had lost 3 years ago, and she was still stuck in that grief. And on top of this, she had a unique disorder called DID, or dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called in the DSM-4, I think, and before it was called multiple personality disorder. Now, I may do a separate video on that at some later point, but that's not the purpose of this. Uh, Needless to say, she switched from these alters and she had ways to deal with severe trauma to be able to divide herself and to try to manage her life. Now, this woman was able to keep a job and function, but she was single and dealing with this grief of the only person that she'd really known. And so in one of the sessions, I used this physicalizing exercise, and we talked about grief. She kept wanting to be with her husband, and she was having a lot of suicidal thoughts and self-harm. And so as we were talking, I did the same exercise I did with you. And what she said is it wasn't like just an object, it was a waterfall that was placed in the middle of the room, kind of, a very miniature size for our purposes. But as she began to talk, we began to interact with this, and she was just saying how it was just a torrent of emotion, torrent of river kind of falling on this waterfall. And when I asked her where her husband was, where she wanted to be with him, he was in the waterfall. And it was just this kind of beautiful image of love and mourning and grief and all that, and this desire to be with him, but also kind of an unsafe, unhealthy way to be with him, which was to end her life. And so we began to kind of talk about it. And it was interesting because from session to session, she would come back to that image of a waterfall. It ended up being very useful to help her have a different relationship with her grief. In this final section, I want to talk about what's happening in this exercise from the therapist's perspective. What is the therapist trying to accomplish by doing this physicalizing exercise? It's not just to have interesting conversations with clients and to see what kind of things they come up with, but it's to serve a purpose to change something in the client's thinking and behavior toward whatever brings them into the session. Now, for Gabriel, he had some things going on that were related to his depression and anxiety. But he had thoughts like, I can't do this while I'm depressed. And that was very paralyzing for him. Now, I mentioned the RFT term, transformation of stimulus function, earlier. And when a client has a thought like this, that I can't do this when I'm depressed like this would be in a network of ideas. So he has depression, and when I'm depressed, he has this thought that I can't do this when I feel like this. And then it's behavior, which is I'm going to lay in bed all day or just sit on the couch and watch TV. And so we have a relationship there. When he comes into the therapy room, I know, I don't know everything about his life, but I know from what he's described, he's got a lot of things going on like this. And so RFT talks about transformation of stimulus function. And so with new learning, when you add to your network, you can change the whole network of ideas. So if the network is called depression, by changing an aspect of that, the way that client relates to depression, you can change the whole network. Okay. So with him, he had this main thought that I can't do this when I'm depressed like this. And so RFT would describe this as a self rule. Now, there's rule-governed behavior that says, when I'm depressed, this is what I'm going to do. And so when you have a self-rule, it's something that that person has arbitrarily decided or chosen to do, but it's also something that's powerful because then it conditions them to continue that behavior in the absence of having that thought. It's basically whenever they feel that way, then they act this way. And so it's hard to break up those self-rules and that rule-governed behavior. And so the way we do this is through creative exercises, like physicalizing exercise. So with Gabriel, this depression, where he had this self-rule that I can't do this when I'm depressed like this, he was able to come up with a new rule that when he had the box, he says, I can carry this box and put it in my trunk and take it with me. And that had the stimulus or transformation of stimulus function to his depression, that now he realized that maybe not in all cases, but in some cases, it's not that it's heavy and I can't move. It's something that I can take with me. It's something that when I'm depressed, I still can do this. I just have to take it with me. And that really, really helped free him up to do, to live his life rather than being trapped at home. Now, the other thing that he said was with anxiety, he said, I can't finish anything. And so there's a lot of anxiety about that because it was like clutter all over his house. He knows he needs to clean it up, but he doesn't even know where to start. And when he starts in one area, there's just, he notices something else that needs to be cleaned up and he goes to that. And so he had this self-rule that said, I can't finish anything. And it was something that was governing his behavior. And so when he talked about the Rubik's Cube and that there was many, many Rubik's Cubes, and that there was a solution, he started to have a new rule, which was, I am working on several things at once, and I can work on this one today. And he could master that Rubik's Cube. And so for him, it didn't solve his anxiety, but what it did is it transformed the way that he interacted with anxiety. Okay, so that's what's happening with the therapist as we're interacting with the client. We're seeing, okay, what's the network of ideas here, the relationships, and then how can we begin to help them by changing the way they relate to those inner experiences. Now, for the second client I mentioned, and the third example of grief, now that was pretty heavy. And I think it was kind of disturbing as she's describing this. It didn't seem like it was helping much because it was like, yeah, she wants to be there. She would go through the torrent of emotions and love to be with her loved one. And it's easy as a therapist to get kind of fused with whatever the client's sharing. But in that, she said something to the effect that I have to get to my loved one, even if that means dying. Okay, so that was a dangerous self-rule that was causing her to harm herself and not be safe. So the way that we did that was when we talked about this, a new learning developed, and she was able to have a new rule, which was, I know where my loved one is. He is there. I am here for now. And is able to give her perspective that she knows where he is, and he's on the other side of the waterfall. And she knows her position. I'm here. I don't like this. I don't like this setting. Even though it's a beautiful waterfall, the grief is not pleasant. But there is a hope too that one day I will be with him, and it'll be in a natural way, not a self-decision way. In this video, we've done a deep dive into one of the exercises that ACT offers to teach willingness. Now, hopefully, you were able to glean some insights, whether it was personal insights when I was doing the exercise, or whether it's from something that the client's perspective offered or the therapist's perspective. Hopefully, you're able to get something that will help impact your life.